I want to give Isaiah and Karina a little bit of time to ask questions of one another in case there are any point or counterpoint interactions you'd like to tease out. And then we'll move into some of the questions that have been posed by our participants.
Maybe just one clarification question for you, Isaiah, if that's okay. So you had said in your last slide, and the way you were discussing it as well, and maybe this is the right term for it, I'm not sure, that blindsight is a clinical syndrome. And I always kind of thought of blindsight as being almost like a feature of consciousness, a feature of conscious experience that I guess I think of it as like a clinical syndrome as being something, and I think you use the word disorder as well, but I sort of thinking as being like a pretty consistent feature of consciousness that so most of us as humans, or I think all of us, experience blindsight like you showed. So I just wonder if you could say maybe what you meant by that, because I do agree with you that blindsight offers this like very important lens into aspects of consciousness, both the unconscious and conscious, and that allows us to distinguish things like phenomenal consciousness from other kinds of consciousness. But I guess I just wonder if you could say a little more about what you mean by that.
Sure, thanks for the question. Blindness due to a lesion in the brain is often not an all or none phenomena, and actually it's somewhat flexible. Actually, about 40% of people who end up having a lesion or more in a part of the brain that causes blindness will slowly regain some degree of vision. And it's not an all or none either. There's a Riddick phenomena, which was described by Riddick in 1917, where people will slowly regain vision and be able to experiencing moving stimuli, but not experiencing static stimuli. And people will lose color vision, for example, rare syndrome as well. And so I use the term syndrome to mean a cluster of symptoms that doesn't have a clearly understood pathophysiology. I would say depression is a syndrome. There's a cluster of symptoms that we group together, but we don't fully understand the underlying pathophysiology.
But it seems to be a feature as well of people who don't have lesions, like what you were, I mean, that there's a kind of blind sight spot or blind spot. Okay.
Yeah, and so yeah, that's a good point. I think I would try and limit the definition of blind sight, and everyone has a different idea, because you can induce blind sight using transcranial magnetic stimulation. And you're right, perhaps we to some degree are able to respond to stimuli we don't experience. If you imagine you're walking in the dark night and you suddenly duck beneath a branch and you didn't experience seeing that, is that blind sight? I think when it comes to a clinical standpoint, when I'm talking specifically about lesions, I would say that it needs to be, to define blind sight should be, and some would disagree, you need to have a visual field cut due to a brain lesion,
okay,
that you're not seeing, and you need to be able to do better than chance in an alternate force choice paradigm in the blind field of a stimulus that you don't experience seeing. So I'd like to limit it to that as trying and using a delineated definition. But I would agree with you that to some extent, I think it's reasonable to say that we as humans often are able to perceive and respond to stimuli that we don't experience seeing.
Mm-hmm. And so, so as a philosopher, my main entry point into this is Ned Block's work on access consciousness and phenomenal consciousness. And so you just sort of, you buy into that distinction too, that you think that's a good and helpful distinction then?
Can you flesh that out a little bit more for me?
Yeah. So Ned Block used a lot of these examples. So he tried to pull apart these two definitions of phenomenal consciousness, just like you think it is. It's the what it's like of experience, or what it is like to have an experience, and then access consciousness, where he gave examples of people who experience blind sight, but above chance were able to point or to make give answers to questions about things that were existing that they couldn't report seeing. And so he said that they have this kind of access to those things, which he described as being a part of their access consciousness, but there was no phenomenal experience. And then likewise, he tried to give examples of things where you had a phenomenal experience of something, but without access, without access to it. So he thought that because those two could vary independently, it was a useful distinction to introduce into the field of consciousness studies.
Yeah, no, I do find that to be actually quite useful, and I try to I think in clinical work and experimental work, it's important to make. It's a useful definition, because I think that most of the information that are, just from a neurological standpoint, I think most of the data that our brain senses and perceives is not experienced, and some of it does rise to the level of experience. And I think differentiating between those phenomenologically and then and then testing those cases to see what the neural correlates are is actually really useful at getting at the neural correlates of phenomenal experience. So I think that is a useful distinction. Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Thanks. Great talk.
Well, thank you.
A few questions that we have from our participants are in the Q&A here, and I'll start with one of Jacob's questions, and this is for you, Karina. Jacob says, if I understand correctly, the auto story relates to information storage. Storing information in one location versus another only changes where that information is stored. There mustn't be information still stored in the body brain memory to be able to retrieve the information. Is information storage itself and retrieval of information, regardless of where it's stored, considered an integral part of cognition, or is it just information storage?
Yeah, so thanks, Jacob. I think traditionally in cognitive science, retrieval of information is seen as an important part of memory. So how do you retrieve that information, and how is it stored exactly? And so in standard practice, memory is seen as a part of cognition. And so what Clark and Chalmers are trying to do is focus on this like core part of what cognitive science looks at, and then to argue that it gives, to use that as an example of something that can happen outside of the mind. So information storage and retrieval. So in this case, it would be, in the case of auto, retrieval through this action and perception loop, which is distinct from the kind of introspective retrieval that Inga would have had. But what they argue is still functionally analogous, even though they're different kinds of processes at a kind of lower level. And so for them, like that they were using that as an example of something that is core to cognition. I should mention, like, so their standard example was to use this auto and Inga case, the one that I gave to you guys, but they don't limit. So their claim is not that only memory can extend. So that while that was the example that I gave you, they also discuss things like planning and decision making, and even navigation. If you think about how you rely on apps in your phone, for example, to navigate, or GPS. So they think that there's a lot of different kinds of offloading that's happening with different types of cognitive capacities, and not just memory, but they use memory as a primary example.
And then Maggie McCann has a follow-up question, and she asks, as part of Otto's mind, is a notebook considered living? And how does this address the theory, how does this theory address the principle of self-determination?
Yeah, good. So the first part is, I don't think it's considered living. I mean, you can think about it again, like, do you consider just a single neuron in your brain, or one cluster of neurons in your brain as living? I guess maybe you would. So, I mean, would you, so there's lots of parts of your body that we don't think as themselves having a mind, or as themselves, having the traits that the whole has. So they're just parts of the whole. And likewise, the notebook is just seen as one node in this cognitive network. So it's just one part. The notebook isn't biological, so it's not sort of living in that sort of standard sense of something that can live and die. So I think it's just considered one part of the network, and the whole person is a living being, but not necessarily every part is. So I'm alive, but my fingernails aren't, my teeth aren't. I mean, that's kind of a weird thing to say, right? So it's making that distinction between parts and wholes, I think, is critical here. So it's a mereological supervenience, in other words, on to the lower level parts. And then the other question was about self-determination. Let me just see where that question is.
No, in the answer, I clicked the answer live done.
Oh,
so
okay.
you go to the answer tab, you'll see it there.
Yeah, how does the theory address the principle of self-determination? Not sure what this question's getting at necessarily. So and on the one hand, there is obviously historically a very interesting relationship and debated relationship between the mind and the self. So many people think that a critical part of the self, or of what a person is their mind. If you're thinking about self-determination in terms of, like, are you asking about free will? I'm not quite sure if I know what the question's getting at. I wonder if Maggie can jump in and give me more content.
If you are able to do a follow-up clarification, Maggie, go for it.
Can I ask a question in the meantime?
Yeah, I was about to say, we can go ahead and toggle over Isaiah.
Yeah, Karina, I love your talk. Thank you so much. Obviously, a brain doesn't exist in a vacuum. There's a brain and a body and a world and a culture. And I'm perfectly willing to say that science exists within language to some degree. And just because I can go and, pull out that light switch there and rip a hole in the wall, and I can't have light in this room, doesn't mean that that's the meaning and cause of electricity. That doesn't mean that that's what electricity is, right? So, I love the theory of extended mind. I would love to hear your thoughts on how can we as researchers apply that and investigate that? What would be your thoughts on how we can apply this in studying the brain in a very real way?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's definitely one of the big struggles here, right? So one thing to mention, Isaiah, which you touch on, is that the extended mind thesis sits within a sort of broader movement within cognitive science, which is called situated cognition broadly, or 4E cognition, which stands for embodied, embedded, extended, and inactive cognition. And all of these views are related insofar as they tend to push back against the standard commitments of traditional cognitive science. In particular, the commitment to what's called internalism, or the idea that the mind just is the brain. So the embodied view, as you would expect, maintains that the mind is more than just the brain. It's actually really connected to other parts of the body. And there's different methods for studying. The people have adopted different methods for trying to study that. With the extended mind thesis, it becomes even more complicated because while there's probably a lot more consistency in how all of us use our bodies and relate to our bodies, it's quite varied in how we use tools and relate to our tools. So I gave you the particular example of somebody named Otto, a fictional character, and we Clark and Chalmers cashed out that character exactly how they wanted to meet their criteria of the thought example, right? So they said, well, the notebook is constant in his life, highly accessible. He relies on the information. It's their example. They can say whatever they want. But how much is that really true in real life? And how much is that true across different people? So such that we could study it, So I think it's only become, at least in my mind, it's only become much more relatively recently that there's a more consistency in how large numbers of people relate to similar tools, such that we can start to study it in a more consistent way. And I think that the obvious example of that is something like a smartphone. So many people now hold that and use that and that use similar platforms on that phone. So things like Google. So there's some interesting studies on like Google effects on memory and how people in test environments are able to complete tasks when they know that information will be readily available to them on Google versus when they don't know, and so forth. So there's some, so I think that like the change in that in society has facilitated us to study this view more consistently, because you can't just study an individual. Obviously you have to study it across many individuals. So it's very complicated in short, but I think we're seeing some cool studies come up. There's another one called Brain Drain, which was also about how people complete tasks when their phone's in their environment versus how they don't, and so on. So, but yeah, it's a good question, Isaiah.
So thank you very much. We'll go ahead and push pause here for the Q&A. There are some outstanding questions in the Q&A section, and feel free to type in responses there, or we could also address them when we have the final Q&A cleanup after this next session here.